my wife, Emily, and I wanted to start a family early in our marriage. We dreamed of having a child to call our own, but no matter how hard we tried, it just didn't happen. Emily couldn't get pregnant, and while our friends celebrated their growing families, we were left empty-handed. She refused to consider adoption, no matter how many times people suggested it. She was set on having a child of her own flesh and blood. As the years passed, Emily grew more and more depressed. She wanted a baby so badly, and I couldn't shake the guilt of not being able to give her one. Eventually, she gave in, and we decided to go the adoption route. On the way to a doctor's appointment before visiting the adoption agency, I tried to lighten her mood, cracking jokes and chatting, but she didn't say a word. She wouldn't even look at me. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw her silently crying. When we arrived at the doctor's office, we signed in and found 2 open seats near the door. Across the room, a man sat alone, staring at us. He had sandy blonde hair and piercing green eyes. Something about the way he looked at me made my skin crawl. As we settled into our seats, the man stood up. He had to be at least 6 feet 5 inches, broad-shouldered and muscular. He walked straight over to us and, in a deep, gravelly voice, said, "Having some trouble, Mr. and Mrs. Carter?" Emily gave me a confused look before turning back to him. "Sorry, do we know you?" she asked. The man chuckled and extended his hand. "No, but let me introduce myself. My name is Brandon Wright, though most know me as Lazarus." Caught off guard, we hesitated before shaking his hand. I asked, "Can we help you with something?" Brandon looked me straight in the eye and said, "It's not me who needs help. It's you." Already upset, Emily snapped, "Look, buddy, just tell us what you want and leave us alone." Brandon stared at her for what felt like forever, and I noticed her hands trembling. Finally, he said, slowly and deliberately, "I know about your struggles, the pain of trying to have a child. What if I told you I could help?" The room fell silent. My mind raced. How could this stranger possibly know about our situation? After an awkward pause, I demanded, "Who are you? Really?" Brandon's expression didn't change. "I serve a higher power. Not God," he said, cutting me off before I could speak, "but the one you know is Satan." I froze, too stunned to respond. Brandon raised his hand slightly, motioning for silence, and continued, "I know what you're thinking. I don't mean you any harm, nor does my master. We've seen the suffering in this world, and we aim to heal it. I've watched you both for a long time and have seen your pain. My only desire is to offer you relief." I couldn't find the words to respond. I glanced at Emily. She sat motionless, her wide eyes locked on Brandon. He leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but intense. "I know this is a lot to process, but I'm here to help you, to help this world." Brandon then pulled out a small bottle from his pocket. The liquid inside was a shimmering purple, almost sparkling if you looked closely. Turning to my wife, Emily, he said, "I know how much you want a child of your own. I've seen the sleepless nights, the tears you've shed in the bathroom." He held the bottle up in front of her face. "Drink this, and your wish will come true." Emily stared at the bottle, her hands trembling slightly. I was stunned when she suddenly reached out and took it from him. I blurted out, "Emily, don't listen to this guy. He's insane. That could be poison for all we know. We can have a child. Even if it's not flesh and blood, it'll still be ours." She hesitated, staring at the liquid, torn between hope and doubt. Then Brandon spoke again, his voice calm but firm. "It's your choice. Your own child, or someone else's." Before I could stop her, she twisted the cap off and, in one quick motion, drank it all. My heart sank as she collapsed to the floor. "What the hell did you do to her?" I yelled, grabbing Brandon by his shirt. He only smiled, unfazed. "She's fine. Give her a day's rest, and the potion will do its work." I lost it. I swung my fist at him, punching him square in the face, but it felt like hitting solid rock. Pain shot through my hand, and I realized I'd broken it. Crying out, I fell to my knees, clutching my hand. When I looked up again, Brandon was gone. Nurses rushed over to Emily and me. I could hear them calling 911. Ignoring the throbbing pain in my hand, I crawled to my wife and pressed my ear against her chest. Relief flooded through me when I felt her heartbeat. I whispered, "You'll be okay, Emily. Everything's going to be okay." At the hospital, the doctors quickly took Emily for a scan while treating my hand, which was confirmed to be broken. After wrapping it in a cast, they led me to where Emily was being checked. When the scans were done, a doctor approached me with good news. "She's fine," he said. "No brain damage or any other injuries." They moved her to a room for observation and suggested I go home and rest. "I'm not leaving my wife," I replied firmly. That night, I stayed by her side. I couldn't sleep at first. Brandon's words echoed in my head, "Let the potion do its work." I kept glancing at Emily, who was breathing peacefully, her face calm. Somehow, I eventually dozed off. When I woke up, she was sitting up, staring out the window. "Emily," I said, rushing to her side. She turned to me with a warm smile. "I heard you broke your hand. Are you okay?" "I'm fine," I said quickly. "But how are you feeling?" She smiled wider and kissed me just as the doctor walked in. "She's doing great," the doctor said. "We ran another scan, and, well, congratulations. She's pregnant." His voice was full of amazement. "I don't know how, but she is. It's incredible." Emily hugged me tightly, tears streaming down her face. I held her, still in shock but trying to let happiness sink in. It worked. The potion actually worked. But how? I looked at Emily's beaming face, and the thought faded. "You're going to be a father now. Be happy." The next few months flew by. Emily was glowing, more full of life than I'd seen her in years, and I was just as thrilled. The mysterious potion and the man who gave it to us barely crossed my mind. We were too busy preparing for the baby. We turned the upstairs spare room into a nursery, filling it with toys and decorating it with care. During a routine checkup, we found out we were having a boy. That was it. We painted the room blue and added all the little touches to make it perfect for our son. As Emily's due date approached, our excitement only grew. Then, on a quiet Saturday morning at 9:36 a.m., her water broke. We rushed to the hospital in a whirlwind of nerves and anticipation. I sat outside the delivery room, pacing nervously. After what felt like an eternity, a nurse appeared and smiled. "Are you ready to meet your son?" she asked in a cheerful voice. "More than ready," I said, my heart pounding. After the nurse led me inside, she walked out, leaving us alone. I stepped into the room to see Emily holding our son in her arms. He was sleeping but stirred awake as I approached. Strangely, he didn't cry, just blinked sleepily, and I could see tears glistening in Emily's eyes as she looked down at him. "Our own beautiful son," she whispered as I leaned in to get a closer look. Tears welled up in my eyes too, and I said softly, "He's perfect." "Do you want to hold him?" she asked, her voice tender. "I'd love to," I replied. Emily carefully placed the baby into my arms, and I stared down at him. His big, dark brown eyes gazed back at me with curiosity, his puffy cheeks rosy and soft. He was so small, but just the right size. Emily and I exchanged smiles, both overcome with joy, when we suddenly heard a familiar voice from the corner of the room. "Congratulations. I'm glad to see you both so happy," the voice said. Our heads snapped in the direction of the sound, and there he was, Brandon Wright, or Lazarus, as he called himself. His dark blonde hair and piercing green eyes were just as I remembered. He stepped forward, his presence as unnerving as ever, and looked down at our son. "He's gorgeous," Brandon said, a faint smile curling his lips. "He's even got your eyes." "Yeah," I muttered, unsure how to feel. "Thank you for helping us." Brandon looked surprised for a moment, then smiled. "Of course. I'm here to make this world a better place for people like you. But you're probably wondering why I'm here now. I'll get straight to the point," he said, pulling a crumpled envelope from his pocket. He handed it to Emily. "The child will be perfectly healthy and normal, as long as you follow these rules." My stomach dropped. I knew it. There had to be a catch. Emily opened the envelope with trembling hands and pulled out a piece of paper. Together, we read the list of rules in stunned silence. The rules. 1. The child's name must be Lazarus, and he must never be called anything else. 2. Do not look at the child while he is eating. 3. The child must not go to school or interact with other children. He won't play well with them. 4. The child must be in bed by 10 p.m. every night. No exceptions. 5. On the child's birthday, he must remain in his room all day, no matter what. 6. If you hear screaming from the child's room, do not go inside. 7. If you see the child's eyes turn yellow, leave the room immediately. 8. On the night of the child's 15th birthday, he must be chained up outside. If he isn't, may the Lord have mercy on your soul. 9. If the child is not chained up as instructed in Rule 8, you must kill him. We stared at the list, our hearts pounding with disbelief and terror. Slowly, we looked down at our son. How could he, so small, so innocent, be this dangerous? Yellow eyes? Chained up? Screaming? What kind of madness had we brought into our lives? Emily's face twisted with anger as she glared at Brandon. What the hell is this? Is this some kind of sick joke? Brandon's smile vanished, and his tone grew serious. This is no joke. Those rules must be followed. No exceptions. I clenched the list in my hands and shouted, "Why? What did you do to him? Did you curse our child?" But when we looked up, Brandon was gone. Emily and I exchanged helpless looks. Then she took my hand and whispered, "David, I think we have to listen to these rules." "This is insane," I said. "That list is ridiculous. How could any of this be real?" Emily shook her head. "David, we're holding a child the doctors told us we'd never have. How much more bizarre could this get?" She was right, I sighed, looking back down at the list. "Okay, let's start with the first rule," I said quietly, cradling my son. I murmured, "Hello, Lazarus." As soon as I said the name, his dark eyes flew wide open, and a small giggle escaped his lips. Emily and I stared at him in shock, unable to ignore the strange feeling that passed between us. "Well," Emily said nervously, "how hard can these rules be?" Lazarus grew up to be a bright and curious child. Emily homeschooled him, and by the time he was 8, he was already mastering advanced math and other subjects. For the most part, the rules were easy to follow. We always called him Lazarus, never anything else. We never looked at him while he ate, and since we didn't live near other kids, Rule 3 wasn't a problem. Rule 4 was simple, too. He was always in bed by 10 p.m. without complaint. But Rule 5 was hard. Every year on his birthday, we had to keep him locked in his room all day. He cried the first couple of times, upset that he couldn't celebrate like other kids, but he never argued. Still, it broke our hearts to deny him something so normal. Then there was Rule 6. That's the one that tested us the most. When Lazarus turned 12, the screaming started. Almost every night, he'd let out piercing cries that made the walls feel like they were vibrating. Emily and I were at our wits' end. We bought earplugs just to try to get some sleep, but even those barely helped. His screams went on for nearly 2 months before finally stopping. After that, life settled back to normal, at least for a while. I never experienced Rule 7, but Emily did. One afternoon, when she was home alone with Lazarus, she turned from the sink and froze. He was standing there, staring at her with glowing yellow eyes. Emily said she bolted out of the kitchen so fast it was like her life depended on it. She swore she felt like she was being chased, though she never heard footsteps behind her. After waiting a minute or two to calm down, she cautiously peeked back into the kitchen. Lazarus was sitting at the table, reading a book like nothing had happened. When he looked up at her, her heart skipped a beat, but his eyes were normal again. For the most part, Lazarus was a regular kid. He never acted strange or showed any signs of being different, at least, not until he turned 13. That's when the changes began. At first, they were subtle. He got angry faster, snapping at the smallest things. His aggression showed in everything he did, whether it was slamming doors or yelling at us over minor disagreements. Then came the growling. At night, Emily and I would wake to the sound of a low, guttural growl coming from his room. It was quiet, but deep enough to send chills through both of us. Rules 3 and 4 became a battle as Lazarus grew older. He didn't want to stay isolated anymore and started pushing back. "Why can't I go to school? Why can't I have friends like everyone else?" he'd demand, his voice filled with frustration. "You just can't, son. I'd say, trying to keep calm. You wouldn't get along with the kids. That's bullshit, Dad. I just want to be normal. I just want some damn friends. What could I say to that? I couldn't tell him the truth, couldn't show him the rules. He wouldn't understand. Or worse, he wouldn't care. To him, rules were just something to argue against. As his 15th birthday crept closer, fear started creeping in too. I went to Home Depot and bought the thickest, strongest chain I could find. When I brought it home, Emily looked horrified. "This is too much," she said, her voice breaking. "We already lock him up on his birthday, and now we're supposed to chain him outside like an animal?" I rubbed my temples and said, "Emily, we have to follow the rules. You know what could happen if we don't. I don't like this either, but we have no choice." Emily's eyes filled with tears, and that whole week, I could hear her crying softly in bed at night. I felt terrible for Lazarus, but I knew the risks were too great. She knew it too, no matter how much it broke her heart. The night before his birthday, during dinner, Lazarus finally confronted us. "Why don't we ever celebrate my birthday?" he asked, his voice calm but sharp. Emily and I froze, exchanging nervous glances. We'd been dreading this question for years, but now that it was here, we didn't know how to answer. Emily spoke first, her voice shaky. "Lazarus, just because we don't celebrate doesn't mean we don't love you." He slammed his fork down, his tone rising. "You didn't answer my question. Why don't we ever celebrate my birthday?" Her silence filled the room. I tried to step in. "Son, we just can't. I know it's hard to understand, and I know it upsets you, but we can't explain it to you." Lazarus narrowed his eyes. "You can't tell me? That's your excuse? And what about locking me in my damn room all day? You can't explain that either?" No, Lazarus," Emily stammered. He slammed his fist on the table, the dishes rattling. "Screw you guys. I hate you," he shouted before storming upstairs. Emily broke down then, sobbing uncontrollably. I reached out to comfort her, but she shoved my hand away. "Our son hates us, David," she cried, "because of these stupid rules. It's not fair, to us or to him." She got up and ran upstairs, her sobs echoing down the hallway. I stayed at the table, staring at my untouched plate. Tears burned at the edges of my eyes as I clenched my fists. There was no winning here. We traded something precious for the impossible, and now we were paying the price. Deep down, I couldn't shake the thought that this wasn't about making the world better. It was about torment. Anyone who works for Satan doesn't want to help. He only wants to see things fall apart. At 11 p.m., I went into Lazarus's room. He was sound asleep. Gently, I picked him up and carried him outside to the shed in the backyard. My hands trembled as I wrapped the heavy chain around him, securing it to the table in the center of the shed. Just to be extra cautious, I locked the shed door after I was done and went back inside. When I glanced at the clock, it read 11:37 p.m. exhausted. I climbed into bed and drifted off, praying the night would pass quietly. But the screaming woke me. It wasn't just the screams that jolted me awake. It was the emptiness beside me. Emily wasn't in bed. Panic gripped me as I jumped up and bolted downstairs, running out into the backyard. There, I found Emily on the ground, her face pale, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I'm sorry, David," she sobbed. "I just couldn't leave him in there all alone. I wanted him to know we care about him, that he's not alone." Her voice broke as she tried to explain, but I barely heard her. My eyes darted to the shed. It was shaking violently, the sound of chains rattling and scraping echoing in the cold night air. Then, we heard it, a sickening metallic snap. "Oh no," I whispered. "The chain's broken." I helped Emily to her feet, and we ran back into the house, slamming the door behind us just as we heard the shed lock shatter. The footsteps that followed were fast and heavy, and they were coming straight for us. We sprinted upstairs, our hearts pounding, and ducked into our bedroom. There wasn't much time to think. We looked around, desperate for somewhere to hide, and scrambled into the closet just as the bedroom door burst open. Through the slats of the closet door, we saw it, or rather, him. No, that wasn't our son. The thing crawling into the room resembled a goblin, its back hunched unnaturally, its glowing yellow eyes scanning the space like a predator. It moved on all fours, growling like a feral wolf. Emily was trembling in my arms, her sobs muffled against my chest. I placed my hand over her mouth to keep her quiet, terrified the creature might hear us. It sniffed the air, its head swiveling toward the closet. Slowly, it crept closer. Its glowing eyes seemed to pierce through the narrow gap in the door. My heart raced. Please, God, don't let it find us. Thinking fast, I grabbed a pile of blankets from the closet floor and draped them over Emily and me. The closet door creaked open, and the growling grew louder. I held my breath as the creature pressed its face against the blankets, sniffing and snarling. It lingered there for what felt like an eternity, and I could feel its breath through the fabric. Emily clung to me, shaking uncontrollably. Then, by some miracle, it backed away. We heard its claws scrape the floor as it crawled out of the room. We stayed frozen in place, too terrified to move. Somehow, we drifted off to sleep like that, huddled together under the blankets in the closet. When sunlight streamed through the cracks in the door, we finally dared to come out. The house was in ruins. Glass shards littered the floor, cabinet doors were ripped off their hinges, and every window was shattered. We called out for Lazarus, but the only response was silence. We searched all day, growing more desperate by the minute, until finally, we called the police and reported him missing. That night, as Emily and I sat in the wreckage of our home, trying to figure out what to do, there was a knock at the door. Before I could stop her, Emily ran to answer it. I chased after her, my heart sinking as she froze in the doorway. Standing there was someone I prayed I'd never see again. It was him, the original Lazarus. He towered over us, his eyes cold, his voice low and hardened. "I gave you a child," he said, "and all I asked in return was that you follow the rules I gave you." Emily and I stood there, speechless. The weight of his words pressed down on us like a heavy stone. "I'm not here to punish you," he continued. "That's not my job. I'm here to warn you. You broke the most important rule. Now, you've unleashed a monster into this world." Emily's voice erupted, raw and furious. "Why did you give us those rules? You ruined his life, our lives. I know my son, and he's not a monster. He needs us now more than ever." The man tilted his head, his voice calm but unnerving. "Did you not read the rules?" "Of course we did," Emily yelled. "Then you know what must be done. That thing out there isn't your son anymore." He stared at us for a long moment, his gaze unyielding. "I hope you'll make the right decision." Without another word, he turned and walked away into the night. Emily slammed the door shut and collapsed against it, tears streaming down her face. "I can't, David," she whispered. "I can't kill our son." She looked at me with tear-filled eyes and whispered, "I can't do it, David." "We have to, Emily," I said firmly, though my voice wavered. "We messed up, and people will die if we don't stop him." Emily's shoulders slumped as fresh tears rolled down her cheeks. Finally, she nodded slowly, her gaze falling to the floor. We knew Lazarus would come back. The only question was when. The next morning, I went to the gun shop in town and bought a shotgun along with a box of ammo. I hated what I was preparing for, but there was no other way. That night, we sat together in the living room, keeping watch by the door. Emily held a kitchen knife in her trembling hands, and I gripped the shotgun tightly, my palms slick with sweat. Hours passed, and the house was eerily silent. At some point, Emily fell asleep on the couch. My eyelids grew heavy, and I was on the verge of nodding off when I heard it. "Mom? Dad?" The voice jolted me awake, and my heart pounded as I sat up straight. Emily stirred, her eyes snapping open at the sound. "He's here," I whispered. Emily started for the door, but I grabbed her arm before she could reach it. "That's not him, Emily. Don't listen to it." Her lips quivered as she looked at me, then back at the door. The voice came again, softer this time, almost pleading. "Mom, I'm cold. I just want to come inside. I miss you guys. I'm sorry for yelling at you." The words cut through me, and for a brief moment, I almost believed it. My hand reached for the door handle instinctively, but a chill ran down my spine, snapping me back to reality. "Don't open it," I said, my voice firm. But before I could stop her, Emily threw the door open. I raised the shotgun, expecting the monstrous form I'd seen just days ago. Instead, I froze. It was Lazarus. He stood there, looking just like he had before. The same boyish face, the same gentle features. He didn't even look disheveled. Emily ran to him, wrapping her arms around him and holding him tight. I wanted to believe it was him. I really did. But something was wrong. Lazarus didn't move, didn't react, didn't even acknowledge her. He just stood there, his head tilted downward. Then, he lifted his face to meet mine. The yellow eyes glowed like fire. "Emily, get away from him," I shouted, aiming the shotgun. She didn't hear me, or maybe she didn't want to. She clung to him, stroking his hair and kissing his head, whispering, "You're home. It's okay, you're home now." And then, in one horrifyingly swift motion, the creature grabbed her. Its teeth, jagged and razor-sharp, sank into her throat. Emily let out a strangled gasp, trying to scream, but no sound came. Blood poured from the wound, staining her clothes and pooling on the floor as she collapsed. She crawled toward me, her hand outstretched, her lips trembling as she tried to speak. I'm sorry," she choked, before her body went still. I stood there, frozen, staring at the lifeless form of the woman I loved. The creature, no, the thing, looked at me now. Its yellow eyes burned with a sickening glee as it smiled, its blood-soaked teeth glinting in the dim light. I didn't think. I fired the shotgun, the deafening blast echoing through the night. But I didn't stay to see if it hit. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the ground as I bolted toward the backyard. I stumbled into the shed and slammed the door shut behind me. My hands fumbled with the lock as the creature's snarls grew louder. The door shook violently as it rammed into it, again and again. I held it shut with all my strength. My shoulders pressed against the wood, but I could feel it giving way. My eyes darted around the shed. A spare lock lay on the workbench. I grabbed it and secured the door just as the hinges buckled under another hard hit. The banging didn't stop. Each blow sent shockwaves through the shed, and I could see the lock beginning to bend. "No, no, no," I muttered, tears streaming down my face. I knew my fate was sealed. I looked down at the shotgun in my hands. If I was going to die, I wasn't going to do it cowering in a corner. The door burst open, the lock snapping clean off. I cocked the gun, aiming it squarely at the creature as it crawled into the shed. Its yellow eyes glowed, brighter than ever, piercing through the darkness. It tilted its head, a chilling grin spreading across its face. "Let's have some fun, Dad," it rasped in a low, guttural voice.